Hi everyone, this is Neil, and what we're going to look at in today's video is we're going to carry on looking at some of the ideas on constructive developmental theory that we've already looked at together in class. And specifically what we're going to try and do is take some of these ideas and think about ways in which we can apply them and use them in ways which are very meaningful to us as teachers. But before we get into that, I just wanted to just quickly address this phrase of meaning making. How do we make meaning? Because it's a phrase that we've used quite a lot, and you'll see used quite a lot in the literature around ideas of constructivist and socio-constructivist approaches to education. And just to be very clear, so that we don't just see this as some buzz phrase or some bit of jargon, when we're talking about making meaning, what we're really thinking of is the activity of how we make sense of our own experiences. And obviously this is just a very day-to-day activity, we're doing it in our life all the time, but we're particularly interested in how our students are making sense of their experiences on the courses that we're teaching, and therefore that draws our attention specifically as teachers to the ways in which people make meaning through identifying and resolving different kinds of problems. Because if you remember from Piaget, one of the things Piaget suggests is that cognitive conflict, in other words, coming across a problem, coming across something that you can't account for already in the way in which you think and understand something, is really the way in which we grow and develop. We have to find ways of dealing with these conflicts, generally through a process of assimilation. Okay, which bits can I understand in the ways in which I already understand? What can I draw into my current understanding? And accommodation, which bits don't quite fit. So how do I need to change my understanding to accommodate to what's come at me from the outside world? And both of those two things are always going on in a kind of a dialogue with each other. Cognitive conflict is the engine for learning, and we've said previously that if we shortcut our students' cognitive conflict, we don't give them the opportunity to make meaning, and sometimes it can be difficult, sometimes it can be a bit of a struggle, and we kind of have this desire to go and rescue our students. But if we do that, we shortcut their meaning-making process, and actually we can make it more difficult for them to learn. There's a nice quote here from Bob Keegan saying, "Thus, it's not that a person makes meaning as much as the activity of being a person is the activity of meaning making." In other words, one of the things that defines us as human beings is that we're constantly making meaning, and that this can be sometimes a troublesome process. So, you could gloss this and say, well, the activity of growing as a person is also the activity of having to make ever more complex and full meanings. I think, by the way, as well, when Piaget talks about, and other people talk about cognitive conflict, in other words, something comes that challenges your thinking, I think we can think more generally about that. I think there are also examples of things like emotional conflict, where you suddenly find yourself in a situation where you can't quite deal with your own feelings. And so through that, you grow to have maybe greater self-awareness or greater capacity to manage your own emotions. So I don't think this is just a head thing. I think this is something which affects us in a much more general kind of a way. Now we might ask ourselves, okay, so why are we looking at this topic at all on the teacher training course? And I would say, well, I think it's because we need to balance the constructive with the developmental. Now what I mean about that is when we talk about how students are making meaning, in a way that's a product. What meaning has a student made of a course? What have they constructed, the constructive side of that? At the end of the course, if you would say to a student, hey, what have you understood about that? What do you think was going on? How would you describe the course back to me? What have you learned? That's the product, right? But there's also a process, there's the developmental process of the ways in which students are making those meanings. And it's not just the meaning that they arrive at that we need to pay attention to, and that's what teachers by and large do. They pay attention to the meaning a student has arrived at and then grade them and give them a better mark if they've arrived at quote unquote better meaning, and a worse mark if they've arrived at a quote unquote worse or more naive meaning. We also need to think about the process through which the student has arrived at that meaning, and that's the developmental side, because actually we can also, as well as helping students to construct meaning, we can also help students get better at the processes they use in order to construct meaning, and that's the developmental side. And that's the side that I find far fewer teachers deal with. They don't deal with the process side as effectively as they deal with the product side. Because, of course, there's a question, which is, do all people construct meaning in the same way? Now, this is a different question from saying, at the end of a module, will all students have constructed the same meaning? Will they all have understood the module and what they've learned in the same way? And we know from experience that the answer to that question is, well, no, of course they don't. You get the assignments in at the end of the course, and you see that students have understood all sorts of different things about the course. Or if it's a very practical course, you get to the end of the course and students have a very different set of skill, different level of skill at the end of the course. Some are very, very skillful, some are less skillful, whatever. So we know that they don't all arrive at the same product. But this is a different question. This is saying, well, have they all used the same process in order to arrive at that product? And if we think the answer is yes, then we might say to ourselves, well, they've all used the same process, but maybe some of them have used the process more effectively than others, or maybe some of them have just put a bit more effort in than others. But actually, what we're suggesting in this whole constructive developmental piece is no, not all people will have used the same process. Some people will have used processes to underpin their learning, to underpin their meaning making, which will have been qualitatively more effective than the processes that other people might have used. Okay, so does that mean that everybody's constructing meaning using completely different processes? Well, no, because again, we can see at the end of the course, if we said to the students, not what have you learned, but how did you go about learning? What processes did you use in order to learn during this course? What you will hear is some regularly recurring answers. And in fact, it's a really good thing to go and do. Go and ask your students, how have you learnt on this course? And you'll very quickly tune into the fact that students will say different things, but you can kind of group them. If you ask sort of, 10 students, a dozen students individually, how have you learnt on this course, and you recorded their answers, you will see that there are certain regularly recurring themes or regularly recurring patterns that emerge. So this is true for somebody learning in a formal setting, but it's true for people learning in an informal setting as well. We make meaning in ways that are different from each other, but there are regularly occurring patterns of the ways in which people make meaning, the ways in which people understand their experience and make sense of their experience to themselves that we see. And the idea of constructive developmental theory, Kegan's constructive developmental theory that we've looked at, is that there are certain sets of ways in which people do this which change and become more complex through their lives. So why is this helpful? Well, one thing that's really helpful is if we can see what kind of process a student is using. If we can identify where they are in their process development, it really helps us tune into scaffolding and supporting where they're at right now. If I can see that a student is making meaning in a particular way, I can offer them feedback which does two things. It supports them in the level they're at. Sometimes you might see a student doing something and you know where you might want to take the feedback a month or 2 months down the line, but you also know that they're just not ready for that feedback yet. So in a way, this is almost the Vygotsky thing of the zone of proximal development. It's figuring out what feedback and what support can I give you now, which is going to be the thing that you're ready for. It's going to be the thing that's going to be your next step. And yes, we partly do that at the level of the product. We partly do that at the level of, okay, what are they understanding? What are they not understanding? But we also need to do it at the level of the process. You would give a student feedback in different ways if, for example, they realise that it's their job to learn independently, or if they think that what they're basically here for is for you to feed them and tell them everything they need to know. You'd go about that in a different way. You want to get everyone to the point of independence, but you have to meet them where they're at. Now, there's a little caveat here, which is that in terms of the Kegan theory that we're going to look at today, it's often tempting to think that as you go up through the levels, somehow you're getting better and better. You're becoming a better person, more sophisticated person, whatever. It's never a race to the next level, right? There's nothing inherent in any level that makes it somehow, quote unquote, better than any other level, right? There's no sort of moral judgment here. The question is, are we at a level of development which is going to let us deal with the complexity of the situation in which we find ourselves? And that's really the theme of Kegan's book, In Over Our Heads. We live in an increasingly, his argument there is we live in an increasingly complicated world, for one thing. Also, as we go through our lives, the kinds of things that we need to do become increasingly complex professionally. It's one thing just having to manage yourself and your own work when you start off as a professional. By the time you then get into a management position or a leadership position, you're having to manage and support the work of lots of other people as well, and maybe balance different priorities, which are very conflicting priorities. So what you need to be able to do becomes much more complicated, much more difficult. And so if you're going to be able to deal with that and not end up in over your head, you need to be able to think in increasingly complex ways. And one of the things, of course, that he says about his constructive developmental theory is that at any stage, you can always still do all the things that you could do at previous stages. Okay, so that's really important. But it's not a race. There's no prize for being the first person from your university who gets to level 4 or whatever. It doesn't work like that. Now, what we're looking at in this video is the big picture. It's looking at somebody's development across their lifespan. What I want to do today is get us to think about this general idea that there are different ways in which people understand themselves. Okay, we're talking about making meaning today, but the specific focus of the meaning making is really how somebody understands and views themselves today. What we will then go on to are more granular versions that focus specifically on the kind of developmental stages that students go through, undergraduate students mainly, but undergraduates, postgraduates, you can take it back to school level students as well. But before we get into looking at that, I think it's really important to look at the bigger picture first, and just really the main skill we're going to be practicing today. And that today's video is going to show you 2 video clips of 2 different people, and I'm going to ask you to try and tune into what stage of development in Keegan's terms you think they're at. And I'm going to take you through the stages of development next. The key skill that we're going to try and practice today, before we get to looking at this specifically in relationship to our students, is how do you really listen to somebody and watch somebody very attentively and carefully and empathetically, so that you can tune into what stage of development you think they're most likely to be at. Okay, and when we're saying that we're listening to somebody empathetically, remember what we mean by that is we're trying to understand how it is that they understand what's going on. So we're not making a judgment about them. We're not thinking about, well, I know what's going on is this, and huh, you haven't seen it. No. We're trying to stand in somebody's shoes and really see what does this look like from their perspective, and then step back from that and go, okay, so what kind of a perspective is that? So in terms of the Keegan model that you've looked at, I'm going to look at stage 2 through 5, so 4 different stages of people's development, of their understanding of themselves, starting with stage 2. Now, if you go back and read early Keegan and then work your way through, you'll find that the stages have always been numbered, and the numbering remains consistent, but the ways that the naming of each stage has changed. There's an earlier set of names which, we talk about the imperial stage and the institutional stage and the interpersonal stage. We're going to go with the names that are being used right now. So in the current version of the model, stage 2 is called the self-sovereign. And in this stage, the person's sense of themselves is ruled by meeting their own needs and their own wishes. Now remember, the whole point about the Keegan system is that, and this remains true for no matter which stage we're at, there are always some things which are object to us. So in other words, some things that we are aware of and we can hold in our consciousness. So therefore it's like an object. You can hold it and look at it. We're particularly tuning into someone's sense of themselves in this particular model. When we look at some of the student models, we'll be tuning into different things. We'll be looking at their sense of what knowledge is, or we'll be looking at their sense of what your job is as a student. We're looking at the most general thing now, and that's to do with your sense of self. So there will always be some things to do with our sense of self, our awareness of ourselves, that we can look at and hold as an object, and can be aware of. But there will be some things that we are subject to. In other words, things that are operating on us, or have, as it were, have power over us, that we're not really aware of, we are subject to. So we can't hold those things as an object in our own awareness. And what happens to each of these stages is that what is subject in one stage becomes object in the next stage. So we become increasingly aware of these different things as we go through the stages, because more and more things that we were subject to, that were, as it were, pulling our strings, become things that are object to us, and therefore we can make choices about. So one of the things that characterises people's development through the stages is they become more and more self-aware, more and more able to take full responsibility for their own actions, more and more aware that there are more choices than they might have realised at an earlier stage, and more capable of making the choice for themselves without being influenced by other people. Okay, so that's kind of roughly some of the things that change between the stages. So in the stage 2, the self-sovereign stage, the person's sense of self is ruled by their own needs and wishes, but they might not be aware. In fact, they won't be. It depends what part of the stage they're at, but they won't really be aware how much they are governed by their own needs and wishes. So to slightly caricature this is the narcissistic, self-obsessed adolescent who really thinks that it's all about them, but doesn't realise that they really think that it's all about them. Okay? In this stage, the wishes and needs of other people are relevant only to the extent in which they will either help you get what you need, so it'll support your own wishes, or get in the way of what you need. So in a way, the person and others inhabit two separate or different worlds, by which we mean it's not that this person can't be aware of what somebody else needs, but what they can't do is they can't hold that awareness of what someone else needs and hold awareness of what they need at the same time, and then negotiate between those two things for a kind of a win-win. Ultimately, their own needs and desires will always win out, and they can only hold one thing in their mind at the same time. The other thing, just to say briefly at this point, is actually when you look at the whole theory in detail, there are a series of 5 sub-stages within each stage, and then transitional stages between the stages. And in fact, the theory suggests that most adults spend more of their life in transition between stages than they do just in a particular stage. But just for the sake of making this a little bit simpler, I think you can think of it simply as, the stage in general, and maybe if you get very tuned into someone, you might think whether you think they're in the early phases of that stage, right in the middle of the stage, or at the point where they're beginning to outgrow the stage and they're maybe ready to move on to the next way of looking at the world. And you can always tell that that's going on because people become more aware of what they're doing and kind of dissatisfied with it or anxious about it, or begin to realise that, do you know what, the way I've always gone about doing things doesn't kind of seem to be working for me anymore. And that can be a stage which is characterised by a lot of uncertainty and anxiety, but actually that's often a stage where somebody is absolutely ripe for some really transformational growth. And don't forget, of course, this links to Mezirov's idea of transformational learning, which is that in the very richest kind of learning, not only are we just learning new stuff and new skills, we learn something so fundamental about ourselves that actually our sense of self undergoes a kind of a transformation. Okay? So this stage 2 stuff will begin in late childhood, go through adolescence. And as we also know from Keegan, some people never in their lives get beyond this stage. When the model was first developed, it was thought that this was just the stage of adolescence, and then you would move on into adulthood. But the more different adults who were looked at and studied in relationship to these stages, the finding emerged very clearly, and actually initially somewhat surprisingly, that no, actually quite a lot of people stay in this stage for the entirety of their lives. So not everybody progresses through the stages, and people don't progress through the stages at the same sort of rate. Once we get into stages 3, 4, and 5, it looks broadly like it takes sort of 10 to 20 years to move through a stage. I mean, these are very fundamental life stages that you don't just kind of romp through quickly. If you're working with, as it were, normal-aged undergraduate and even postgraduate students, so in other words, not mature students, you're just going to find people in stage 2 and stage 3, or in stage 2, transition 2 to 3, and stage, early parts of stage 3. You don't really find anybody beyond any of those stages, and you wouldn't expect to. That it's completely normal development to find people in those stages. The other thing, finally, about stage 2 is I find it really useful to know this, because it means that you can perhaps feel a little more kindly towards adolescents if they're being really irritating, because you just, as an adult, perceiving them as being very wrapped up in themselves and self-obsessed and self-absorbed, because you think to yourself, well, actually, do you know what? That's the stage they're meant to be at right now. Feels rather different if you meet someone in their 40s and 50s who's still behaving in that stage, because you might have an aspiration, which may not have been met, that you might hope that they'd have moved on a little bit. Anyway. So stage 3 is the socialised stage, and this is where the person's sense of themselves is socially determined. In other words, it's largely based on the real or imagined, needs and expectations of other people. What happens in this stage is that we internalise what we think other people think about us. So, one of the characteristic behaviours at this stage is that people often try to please other people, because then you get positive regard from the other person, and you internalise that, and you can feel really positive about yourself. The other thing that very often happens in this stage is that the people you identify with may be individuals, but may also be groups. So people in this stage often will buy into a particular political set of beliefs, for example. Not necessarily like an individual political party. It's not like saying, well, you're a Labour voter, but you buy into a certain set of political beliefs. I don't know, about social justice and equality or whatever. Not that in any way, as I said earlier on, not that in any way that's a bad thing, but that's just what happens at this stage. or you might buy into a set of religious and spiritual beliefs, for example. So you can see how this is very different now, because in stage 2, your sense of self is ruled by your own needs and wishes. In stage 3, your sense of self is ruled by the needs and wishes and expectations of other people. I mean, that's a very fundamental shift between stages. Okay, that's the socialised stage. And then just to show you the rest of the model, stage 4, the self-authoring stage, what happens here is that your sense of self is determined by the values that you have now self-authored or chosen for yourself. Now, these values may be based on the kind of values that you held in the socialized stage. You may still believe in the same political beliefs or the same religious or spiritual beliefs, but now it's because you've tested them out for yourself, and you've found for yourself that this is what you believe works for you. So it's not because, as it were, other people tell you that you should believe these things or expect you should believe these things, or you believe them because you want the positive regard of other people. You believe them now because they're self-chosen. And there are 2 little ways in which I find helpful to think about this. One is the notion of the inner compass. So I'm making decisions now based on my own internal compass, my own inner self. And if you're working with clients, one of the questions you can ask them around making decisions as well, whose voice is that telling you to make that decision? Is it your own voice, or is it someone else's voice? Is it like your parents' voice or your boss's voice or whatever? And people begin to tune in to knowing whether they're really making the decision for themselves, or whether in fact it's being governed by something outside of themselves. And don't forget, in stage 3, the socialised stage, people will probably believe that they are entirely making the decision for themselves, but they're not. And the reason that they believe that is that they're subject to it. They're subject to other people's opinions and positive views of them, and they don't realise that. So they'll think they're making their own decisions without realising that actually what they've done is they've internalised someone else's view of the world. The other way of thinking about stage 4 is the difference between the firm line and the dotted line. So if we have kind of a dotted line around ourselves, we take in things from the outside much more in the way I just described. If we have a firm line around ourselves, we don't just take in the stuff from around us. We make much more choices for ourselves. Now, that kind of sounds like, and this is something that Bob Keegan pointed out, that kind of sounds like how we expect an adult to be and how we expect an adult to behave, right? But in fact, only a minority of adults fully achieve this stage, and not really until their early 40s, generally. Late 30s, early 40s would be as early as you would expect people to achieve this stage. And stage 5, the self-transforming stage, is where your sense of self isn't bound just by your values that you've chosen for yourself or a particular aspect of yourself or your own history. You're able to be, as it were, much more free-floating, much more able to just allow yourself to respond to the moment, focus on the flow of your life, and hold different value systems together at the same time. In self-authoring, you're very geared around your own value system, and you will go kind of mano to mano with other people around, oh, your value system is different from mine, right, that's going to cause a conflict. We're either going to negotiate that, or I'm going to try and persuade you that my value system is better than yours, or whatever. In stage 5, it's like, no, actually, it's fine. You've got a different value system, but I can see where that comes from. I'm aware of what my own value system is. I see why it's different from yours. I know why it's come to be from that place. And actually, maybe I can transcend both of those and see ways in which, whilst they apparently look different, they have large areas of common ground. One of the things that's important to realise about these stages, by the way, is that you really only understand a stage when you've left it. Because by definition, when you're in a stage, you can't see it, because lots of the elements of that stage are things that you are subject to. And by definition, anything you're subject to, you are unaware of. It's invisible to you. So we can have a kind of an intellectual understanding of the different stages, yeah? But we don't really have a genuinely felt sense of the stage until we've left it. And this is really important, because one of the things that we need to be aware of in this model and be a little bit kind of cautious and humble about really in ourselves is that any understanding we have of a stage which is ahead of our own will only be a view from the stage that we're in ourselves. So if somebody's in stage 2 and you describe stage 4 to them, they can kind of get what stage 4 looks like, but they don't really understand it because they can only understand it from a stage 2 kind of perspective, and that's actually really important. One of the ways in which you see that, if you do any reading around this, is when you read people's descriptions of stage 5. Now, stage 5 is hardly ever achieved at all. Maybe, I don't know, one person in several hundred, right? And it's only likely to be achieved for somebody in their late 40s, early 50s onwards. So a lot of people who are writing about this model themselves won't necessarily have achieved stage 5. And when it was first described, it was described as a sort of a theoretical construct. Well, now people have been discovered who are in this stage, right? But very often when you read about it, what you will see is the writing gets really vague at this point. So someone can write really clearly about stages 2, 3, and 4, and then suddenly their writing about stage 5 becomes kind of vague and speculative, and you can see that they're kind of groping towards something and finding it difficult to explain. To me, that suggests that the person writing hasn't fully reached stage 5 themselves. They might be in stage 4, 5 transition, they might be in stage 4, whatever, but they haven't fully reached stage 5. So I think that's kind of a good illustration of the fact that we don't really understand a stage until we've left it behind. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you 2 videos, short clips, about 3 or 4 minute clips, of 2 different people talking to Carl Rogers. Now we've already met Carl Rogers on the PG Cert, and I just thought it'd be really, really fun for you to see him in action. It's so great. Now the quality of both the films aren't great because they were filmed in the late 60s, early 70s. And I'm showing you the opening clips of both films, about an hour long, of somebody sitting down and having an hour-long session with Carl Rogers. Unbelievably brave of them, I think, to allow themselves to be recorded in this way, because his films have been watched probably hundreds of thousands of times because they're used on therapist and counselling training courses all over the world. And what I'm going to ask you to do is watch the film. You're going to see Gloria first, and you're going to see Steve second. And while you're watching, think to yourself, what stage of development do I think this person is in and why? Okay, so here's Gloria first.
Good morning.
Hello, Dr.
I'm Dr. Rogers. You must be Gloria.
Yes, I am.
Let's have this chair. Well, we have half an hour together, and I really don't know what we'll be able to make of it, but I hope we can make something of it. I'd be glad to know whatever concerns you.
Well, right now I'm nervous, but I feel more comfortable the way you're talking in a low voice, and I don't feel like you'll be so harsh on me. But,
I hear the tremor in your voice, so you are uneasy.
well, the main thing I want to talk to you about is I'm just newly divorced, and I had gone in therapy before, and I felt comfortable when I left, and all of a sudden now the biggest change is adjusting to my single life. And one of the things that bother me the most is especially men, and having men to the house, and how it affects the children, and the biggest thing the thing that keeps coming to my mind I want to tell you about is I have a daughter, 9, who at one time I felt I had a lot of emotional problems. I wish I could stop shaking. And I'm real conscious of things affecting her. I don't want her to get upset. I don't want to shock her. I want so bad for her to accept me. And we're real open with each other, especially about sex. And the other day she saw a girl that was single but pregnant, and she asked me all about, can girls get pregnant if they're single? And the conversation was fine, and I wasn't at ease at all with her until she asked me if I'd ever made love to a man since I left her daddy. And I lied to her. And ever since that, it keeps coming up to my mind because I feel so guilty lying to her, because I never lie and I want her to trust me. And I almost want an answer from you. I want you to tell me if it will affect her wrong if I told her the truth or what.
And it's this concern about her and the fact that you really aren't, that this open relationship that has existed between you now you feel is kind of
Yes, I feel like I have to be on guard about that, because I remember when I was a little girl, when I first found out my mother and father made love, it was dirty and terrible, and I didn't like her anymore for a while. And I don't want to lie to Pammy either, and I don't know.
And I sure wish I could give you the answer as to what you should tell her.
I was afraid you were going to say that.
Because what you really want is an answer.
I want to especially know if it would affect her, if I was completely honest and open with her, or if it would affect her because I lied. I feel like it's bound to make a strain because I lied to her.
But she'll suspect that, or she will know something's not quite right.
I feel that inside she'll distrust me, yes. And also I thought, well, gee, what about when she gets a little older and she finds herself in touchy situations? She probably wouldn't want to admit it to me because she thinks I'm so good and so sweet. And yet I'm afraid she could think I'm really a devil. And I want so bad for her to accept me. And I don't know how much a 9-year-old can take.
And really, both alternatives concern you, that she might think you're too good or better than you really are.
Yes.
And she might think that you're worse than you are.
Not worse than I am. I don't know if she can accept me the way I am. I think I paint a picture that I'm all sweet and motherly, and I'm a little ashamed of my shady side, too.
I see. It really cuts a little deeper. If she really knew you, could she accept you?
This is what I don't know, yes.
Okay. So, and you may want to watch this 2 or 3 times, you may want to go back, but, where would you say Gloria is likely to be in terms of her developmental stage, having viewed that? And remember that, if you go and you learn about this stuff, there's a particular way in which you try to assess someone's developmental stage called the subject-object interview. One of the first things you learn is that trying to assess someone's developmental stage is a little bit like putting your finger on a watermelon pip. The minute you think you've put your finger on it, it's going to shoot off in some other direction. So this does need a very high degree of caution. What we don't want to do is jump to some immediate conclusion and go, yeah, I know exactly what stage they're in. And then all we do is we either consciously or unconsciously just tune into evidence which confirms our initial hypothesis, right? So this is very much a case where you want to have your best hypothesis and your best alternative hypothesis running together, and you want to hold these two hypotheses quite lightly. You really need to develop the capacity while you're doing this to have a hypothesis and then actively look for information or evidence that would go against your hypothesis so that you can improve it. And incidentally, that's also a very good way of thinking about how you go about improving your teaching. In our action research projects, we come up with hypotheses about why we think certain things are happening. It's very easy then just to fall into confirmation bias and just look for the stuff that would agree with that. It's much more developmental to try and find evidence that would go against it so that you can then refine and improve your own hypothesis. It's like kind of cognitive conflict all over again. So you want to think about what's your best hypothesis, what's your best alternative hypothesis, and then what exactly did Gloria either say or do that makes you think this? And as I say, you may well want to review the footage all over again. Now, one of the reasons that we're going to do this with these 2 movies, by the way, is that exactly the issue I've just talked about. It's really important that we go and we start using some of these models to identify where our students are at. And the reason we're identifying where our students are at, don't forget, is not so that we label them or come to judgments about them. It's so that we come to be ever more skilled at meeting them where they're at developmentally and taking them through the developmental process and figuring out what the next step is for them in their process as well as the next step is for them in their product. In other words, their knowledge, skills and understanding as they're growing through our teaching. That's really important. But if we all talk about and describe the students that we've seen and where we think they're at, very valuable as that is, the chances are we will only bring forward evidence that supports our hypothesis, and probably at the most only one other tutor will have seen that student in that situation with you. So it's really difficult to know how we're going to draw any conclusions about how accurately or not you're using some of these models and tools. If, however, we all work on the same piece of evidence, so the same clip, we can then see to what extent we actually come to agree or come to disagree. So, and it's not, of course, like there is a correct answer, right? I know what my view is about where I think Gloria is developmentally, and I know what evidence I've got for that. I've actually sat and watched this video, the full video, with Bob Keegan, and I know where he thinks Gloria's at and what his evidence is for that, and it happens that we agree, not that that particularly matters, but that doesn't make either of us right. It doesn't even make Bob right, even though he's the person who, as it were, invented this whole system, came up with this whole system, because, we don't 100% know, but we can make a very well-informed judgment about it. Okay, so if we all work on the same things and all see what our ideas are, then we'll be able to kind of tune into not only calibrate our understanding of the system with each other, but also tune into what makes it difficult to make these, to feel absolutely confident about your decision. What kinds of evidence are you looking for, and what kinds of evidence can you discount, and what happens when you see things, where you think, oh, at this moment she's in that stage, oh, blimey, at this moment she seems to be in that stage. They're completely different stages. How do we deal with that? Okay, so watch the footage, I would say 2 or 3 times, and then think to yourself, where do you think Gloria is most likely to be in terms of her developmental stage? What's your best hypothesis? What's your best alternative hypothesis, and why? I would pause, I would do that now, And when you're finished with Gloria, then we can go on to Steve. The other way you could do it, of course, is to just watch this all the way through the first time, and you'll see Gloria and you'll see Steve and you'll see some of the ways in which they're different. And for some of us, that's actually quite a helpful approach, because you know, by seeing how people are different, sometimes that helps people calibrate and tune in. Okay, so here's a similar length clip of the beginning of the session with Carl Rogers and Steve.
Feel ready? You feel ready?
Yes.
I don't know what caused you to volunteer, why you're here, but I'd be glad to hear whatever's on your mind.
I was invited to volunteer, and I happily accepted. I want to do this, and it was an opportunity presented to me, so I'm here.
Okay.
And I'm feeling quite frightened. And I have not picked out for myself any agenda right now. I can talk a little bit about what's going on in my life, which is my ongoing agenda, I suppose.
But the immediate agenda is that it's kind of scary.
Yes. And I feel really very exposed and self-conscious. But I also feel that some part of me is delighted to be sitting here in front of you and talking to you. I'm a little distracted by some noises behind me of a rumbling. I don't know if that is.
I think that's outside. Anyway, let's try and disregard that.
Okay. I feel not quite as anxious now as I did a moment ago. Most obvious thing for me to talk about is the fact that I'm going through a divorce. Papers were filed in spring, and the divorce should be final in the fall. There's lots of material there, which is very close to the surface for me. I am in a small group which I value very highly. It's been very good for me. And 2 days ago I did a lot of intense work in that small group, ventilated a lot of pain, and talked about what's going on with me, and got some excellent support from my group. Right now I'm feeling a little strange about repeating what I just said at that time.
I don't quite know whether that's the place to start or not, but at least that was helpful to you, I'm gathering.
Yes.
Really got some things out.
Yes. I'm feeling sad that the workshop is going to end in about 24 hours. I feel, with respect to many people here, both a strong connection and some pain that I haven't spent more time with various individuals, ambivalence. And now I'm feeling awkward, because I feel as though it's my task to produce something to talk about, and I'm not quite sure what to do with that, and I'm afraid of making a decision which will feel artificial. And so I'm feeling, well, part of me wants to be passive and wait for something to be suggested to me.
It is kind of a tough spot, because you don't want to produce a problem. If there is anything you want to talk about, you want it to be real.
That's right. I was immediately, as you said that, I thought of some things that I was feeling as I heard you talking in the first hour and a half. And I was moved by several of the things that you said and the reports you gave. And it comes from a place in me which just very passionately and deeply wants connection, harmony, peace.
Okay, and then the same questions with Steve as we had with Gloria. Where do you think Steve's likely to be in terms of his developmental stage? What's your best hypothesis, best alternative, and what exactly did he say or do that makes you think this? And again, you'll want to review that footage 2 or 3 times. You may not experience this in the same way that I did, but certainly I found Steve initially harder to get a read on that I felt relatively confident in, than I did Gloria. You may not experience that way, but that's certainly where I experienced them. I know that that's not an uncommon reaction to seeing this piece of footage. So it'll be very interesting to see what you make of that. Okay, so I hope you really enjoy that activity. And remember, the point of this is not, I mean, the chances are you may never use this particular theory of adult development, constructive adult development. You may not even necessarily buy into it. I mean, I find it, through my own use and experience of this theory, really helpful and effective for scaffolding people's development and growth. But that really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter actually whether you buy into this or don't buy into this. What matters is that what we're trying to do is we're practicing our skills of looking at an empirically derived model or idea about the developmental stages that people typically tend to go through, and really learning to use it. And it's the learning to use it bit that's important this week. It's the bit about tuning in to somebody else to really see where you think they're at developmentally. And actually, you know, if you watch Carl Rogers, one of the things I really notice when I watch him is the quality of his attentive listening. You know, he's incredibly attentive when he listens to somebody. And really this is what this is about. It's about some of the coaching skills of active listening and empathic listening, really listening for what does this look like from that person's perspective? Not do I agree with it, disagree with it, is it the same as my perspective, is it different from my perspective? It's like, what does the world look like to this person? Can I get inside their head or stand in their shoes and see what things look like from their perspective? That's the tuning in skill, and the skill of being very attentive and empathic that we're really practicing this week. And that's going to be the foundational skill then for using some of the models which are particularly about students' development. And it's in slightly different ways for the students, isn't it? Because it's not so much about their sense of self. It might be about their sense of what they're doing as a learner, and we try and get them more sophisticated in that, or what they think knowledge is, and we get them more sophisticated in that. But really it relies on that same sense of being able to identify as accurately as possible, but with the caveat that we might have got it wrong, okay, where somebody is at, so that we can help them develop from that point forwards. And of course the other slight difference between constructive developmental theory and the models that we're going to look at for student development, the Marcia Baxter McGolder stuff and the Patricia King and Pasquello and Terenzini, is that with constructive developmental theory, you're not actively trying to progress people, because it doesn't happen over a short period of time. As we said, each stage might take 10, 20 years to go through. You're just learning the art of figuring out where you think somebody is developmentally. What we then add when we look at the student models is not only are we trying to figure out where our students are developmentally, we are trying to get them to higher levels of those models, because we are trying to improve their processes of understanding what knowledge is and becoming more effective at being really effective learners. So there we are actually trying to move them forward through the process, and that's why we're starting with this first, because this is just looking at the where are you at part. And you probably have discovered by this point in the video that's complex enough as it is before we even get into the where are you at right now, how do I help you move forward? And that's what we're going to come on to when we start looking at the work with the students. So enjoy, and remember, these are very complex high-level skills that frankly most teachers never get to. So I'm very excited that we're going to be working on developing these together. Have fun.